It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Donna Hurlburt. She's the manager of the biodiversity program at the Nova Scotia Department of Lands and Forestry. She has an undergraduate degree in agriculture from the Truro Agricultural College, as it was, now Dalhousie. She did her master's here at Acadia on some endangered small mammals that live in local wetlands. She did her PhD at the University of Alberta, also my alma mater, where she worked on an unusual mutualism between an endangered plant and its moth pollinator. We're very fortunate to have her come back to Nova Scotia, where she worked as the Indigenous student advisor at Acadia for a few years, and now she's moved to become a full-time conservation biologist with the province. So without any further ado, please welcome Donna.
Alan, thank you, in Mi'kmaq. It's a pleasure to speak to you all on Orange Shirt Day. That's the day where we honor the Indigenous children who are sent away to residential schools. I'm not wearing an orange shirt today. I had a few meetings where it probably wouldn't have been appropriate, but I did put the symbol on my introductory slide, and you'll notice that there's an awful lot of orange throughout the presentation. It's also the eve of Treaty Day in Nova Scotia. It's held annually on October 1st, and it marks the beginning of Mi'kmaq History Month. Its purpose is to promote awareness about the Mi'kmaq and to celebrate the 1752 Treaty of Friendship and Peace. One thing you may have noticed as you listen to my bio is that it lists off a series of accomplishments or endpoints. Bachelor's degree, check. Master's degree, check. PhD, check. Participation, exciting committees, check. Academic career or gainful employment in STEAM. And some of us even added at the end of our bios, 1 partner, 2.1 kids, and 1 dog, check. But the one thing that we rarely recognize as important is the process or the actions behind our accomplishments. In short, we often fail to celebrate the stories of our lives, and especially the stories of achieving our education and careers. So many of us sum up our careers as a straight line trajectory from point A to point B. We may feel anxiety or feel like a failure if we can't get to the end point that we've set out to reach. Many of us in STEAM have type A personalities, and we're very eager to get to our destination. And we're hard on ourselves if we don't take a direct path to get there. However, in reality, careers in science, technology, arts, engineering, and math are not straight lines. They are in fact a series of loops and curves, high and lows, representing a series of experiments, trials and errors from which we learn, and from where we learn our passions. These loops and turns also provide us with a series of moments where we can make new choices, opportunities to change course and to learn something new, or to try new life experiments. As a Mi'kmaq woman, I've learned to embrace these tortuous opportunities, especially as I shifted from academic to consultant, to student advisor, and now as a manager of biodiversity with the provincial government. I like to think this approach to life is in alignment with my cultural upbringing. In the English language and in science, we tend to isolate parts and name them so that they are distinct. Indigenous languages, however, are verb-based and emphasize the relationships and the connections. It's about the journey, not about the endpoints. The best thing about STEAM fields is that they are about exploration and relationships. So they're not really all that different. My Mi'kmaq ancestors lived and worked in southwest Nova Scotia, or in the Mi'kmaq district of Gaspawaig. My ancestors traveled the waters and lands between Liverpool and Bear River, along the Mersey and Medway rivers, along Lake Rosagno, and in the area now known as Kejimkujik National Park. They subsisted on caribou, moose, salmon, eel. They harvested fur animals and gathered berries, bark, wood, and leaves for food, medicines, baskets, and tools. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, my great-grandfather, Sam Glode, and my great-grandfather, Louis Glode, worked as hunting and fishing guides for primarily rich Americans out of Milford House. At that time, salmon, eel, and moose were plentiful. But by the early 1900s, Sam conveyed some significant changes in the landscape to author and historian Thomas Riddell. I'll read you his words. There were caribou in western Nova Scotia when I was young, and I remember my father and others bringing home caribou meat on tabagans in winter. Tabagans are toboggans. I never saw caribou trails in Nova Scotia, but I never did much hunting far away from the Mersey River in those days, and I never saw a caribou there myself. They were getting scarce in the 1900s, and pretty soon they were gone. I've heard old Indians say that the caribou in western Nova Scotia used to travel towards the east end of the province every spring. They used to travel along the middle of the country. I remember one old man saying, when the caribou died out, that it was the building of the railroads between Bridgewater and Middleton, and between New Germany and Caledonia that stopped the caribou moving. Fast forward many decades later, I'm sitting around committee tables deliberating on the endangered species status of woodland caribou, Nova Scotia mainland moose, Atlantic salmon, American eel, and black ash, all species of cultural significance to my Mi'kmaq family, and most of those species have declined precipitously during my adult lifetime. Caribou has been extirpated from the province since the 1930s. Moose are down to less than a few hundred on the mainland. Atlantic salmon in my region of the province has declined by over 90% in 30 years. American eel has been assessed as threatened, and black ash and other ash species is expected to decline by over 98% due to an invasive beetle that has recently arrived in Nova Scotia in the Bedford area. It's called emerald ash borer. I worry about what that means for the persistence of Mi'kmaq culture, the Mi'kmaq words associated with the plants and animals, the stories of hunting, harvesting, and use. As those plants and animals disappear, pieces of my story also fade. One of the most important aspects of being a conservation biologist is passion to make the world a better place. For me, it's the passion to keep the stories of my winged, finned, and four-legged brother and sisters alive. I worry about whether my Mi'kmaq children will be able to keep those stories going, or if they will have sufficient passion, given they've never known some of those plants and animals. If they've never fished or eaten salmon from a river, if they've never called or seen a moose in the wild, have never eaten eel or held a black ash basket, because those species no longer exist, how do you fight for something you've never known? I didn't start out wanting to be a conservation biologist. I actually don't remember learning anything about ecology or conservation biology in elementary or high school. But I knew I wanted to work with animals, so like many people, I decided I wanted to be a vet. I started out at the Nova Scotia Agricultural College, and I enrolled in a BSc Agriculture with a specialization in animal science. I quickly realized that I wasn't going to have the marks to pursue veterinary medicine. I was an okay undergraduate student, and I did complete my program, but I really wasn't geared to the style of classroom learning that came along with an undergraduate degree. I then enrolled in the MSc program here at Acadia in biology. I worked on the movement of wetland small mammals. I tracked them with a colorful powder that glowed in the dark under UV light. I actually crawled around the wetlands across from Henniger's Farm Market at night on my hands and knees. Many nights with a strange little light in hand. I also did a stint with snapping turtles and Blanding's turtles at Keji, and worked towards the end of my degree as a wetlands biologist for the same department that I'm now employed with. None of these programs, nor the PhD that followed, provided any connection with my Mi'kmaq roots. There were no programs or supports for Indigenous students at most universities at that time. I had some critical challenges during those first two degrees. I really didn't attribute them to my upbringing at that time, but I now realize that both my understanding of the world and my values were different than many of my peers. First, perspectives in the classroom only focused on ecology. They didn't place plants and animals in the context of the real world. There was no discussion of social values, cultural use, or how economics and politics play a role. In the context of my current job, I can assure you that those are all very large matters. In the Mi'kmaq world, all of those factors are equally as vital. As humans, we too are part of the natural world. Second, much of the information presented in class was presented as fact, with little acknowledgement of the complexity and variability of systems. Third, there was a prevailing position that humans were dominant over the natural world. I could wrap my head around that in the context of agriculture, but not so much in conservation biology, where we talked about managing wildlife, regulating water, and where we manipulated natural systems in order to understand them. Even now in my current job, I'm perplexed by the increasing prevalence of people wanting to intervene with natural processes to prevent suffering by wildlife. Finally, I found the structure of senior class level discussion-based courses really difficult. And it wasn't that I found speaking an issue in class, but rather I was accustomed to only making up my mind after I heard everybody else's point of view. Decisions are meant to be made through careful deliberation that included all perspectives. And typically in discussion-based courses, there was a small handful of people that dominated the conversation, and those were the views that came forward. So conservation biology, at first, didn't appear to be a perfect fit with my values. It's a crisis discipline, so we often act before all facts are known, and uncertainty is inherent. We often act on a precautionary basis. We use single species approaches, not ecosystem approaches, that connect all living and non-living things. And we fail to recognize the complexity and the interdependence. We tend to focus on protection, despite social costs. It tends to be heavy-handed, lots of regulatory processes, and humans are dominant over nature. Rarely did we involve community in deliberations. Conservation problems are human problems, so why don't we involve everyday humans, especially youth and elders, in discussions? Fortunately, when I started my PhD at University of Alberta, I tackled a project that felt much more in alignment with my ambitions and in tune with my values. I worked on the mutually beneficial relationship between yucca plants and yucca moths at the northern edge of the range. Yucca plants are the only host to yucca moths, and yucca moths are the plant's sole pollinator. The developing moth larvae eat some, but not all of the developing seeds, so it results in a net benefit to both the plant and the moth. The ecological system was complex and involved multiple species and processes. It involved populations at the northern edge of the range, as well as those that were further south. So I got to explore the variability of the system over space and time. Both species were rare in Canada, and my work actually led to their listing under the Federal Species at Risk Act. The work was new and previously unstudied, so I was completely in the driver's seat, and I was allowed to take the inquiry wherever I wanted. The work was in an agricultural setting, and I had to engage frequently with the ranching community. Having that BSc in agriculture was a bonus, both in being able to hold meaningful conversations with ranchers, but also in being able to understand how the threats related to agriculture played out in the landscape. Finally, these species lived in the heart of an amazing cultural landscape, previously occupied by the Blackfoot people. There were teepee rings, stone effigies of turtles and snakes, and stone medicine wheels in the area. And the circle on the slide actually shows the positioning of a teepee ring. It's not very clear, but my study plants were all kind of mixed among these teepee rings that were spread throughout the landscape. I had to actually inquire about the role that Indigenous peoples may have played in the plant getting to that area of the world. It was an isolated population, quite some distance from nearby populations. and I had to seek their knowledge to help me better understand what I was seeing. In short, I fell in love with the ecological complexity, the geology, the indigenous culture, and the people of the area. And to this day, I periodically return to visit and monitor those populations. The indigenous elements, however, really awakened an interest in indigenous knowledge and the role that it plays in conservation biology. In 2005, I was appointed to the Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee of COSEWIC. COSEWIC stands for the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And our role was to help assess and integrate Indigenous knowledge into the assessment of species that were thought to be at risk of extinction in Canada. The use of Indigenous knowledge in environmental decision-making was very new at that time. There wasn't much guidance available, and there weren't many examples on how it could work in practice. It was quite theoretical at that point in time. I was part of that committee for 13 years and co-chaired it for 8. And I had the wonderful fortune of working with Indigenous knowledge holders and elders from across this country on a wide variety of species at risk, including species like polar bear, narwhal, bowhead whale, black ash, American eel, salmon. This work helped introduce me to others in the country who also navigate the line between Western scientific and Indigenous worldviews, including Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall and his late wife, Merdina Marshall, who are from Eskasoni in Cape Breton. Albert describes this amalgamation of perspectives as two-eyed seeing. So he says two-eyed seeing is to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western ways of knowing, and to use both of these eyes together. He believes that knowledge from Indigenous peoples and from Western science is complementary, and it should be used for the benefit of all. Albert was awarded an honorary degree by Acadia in spring 2018, and I was privileged to be able to introduce him. After finishing my graduate work and a postdoc on forest regulations pertaining to peatlands, I established a consulting company where I specialized in species at risk science and the application of Indigenous knowledge in environmental decision-making. It was a unique niche, and I had all of the supporting credentials, so I was very successful at it. It did have its good points and its bad. For good points, I had steady work, and I had an income that actually exceeds my current salary working for government. It had flexibility, so I could take advantage of all the opportunities that came my way. So as a result of that, I had ministerial appointments to committees in both Canada and internationally. I attended conferences and workshops, and I got to travel and see a lot of places off the beaten path. It was self-driven learning and self-driven experiences, lots of variety in my work. I set my own hours, and I took Fridays off. Household expenses by running my office out of my home were written off. And I made lots and lots of connections, many of which still persist to this day. There were a few cons, though. There was lots of paperwork. I had to be a bookkeeper, which I discovered was not one of my strengths. Some isolation when I wasn't traveling, and I had a lot of work to do. Don't tend to get out much when you're a squirrel down in your home office and trying to pump out a few reports. I had a few dry spells where there wasn't a great deal of income, but not very many though. Mostly I had too much work. I lacked employment benefits. And really, to grow my business, I needed to expand and hire people, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to do that. And then in 2014, I tried a life experiment and I adopted a couple children. And I discovered that consulting wasn't completely compatible with young children, especially when a lot of my work was derived from traveling. So finally, I sit in my current job as Manager of Biodiversity for the Department of Lands and Forestry. I deal mostly with policy and application of laws to biodiversity and species at risk conservation. I'm usually not involved in the run-of-the-mill matters, but those that are new emerging issues or those with a high level of complexity or risk. Often there's no right answers to the situations that I'm dealing with. I'm in a decision-making role. I often have to make decisions in short order on incomplete information. I'm comfortable doing that now, but where I wasn't earlier on in my career, and that was because I've experienced such a wide breadth of issues and situations leading up to this point in my life. The job is very fast-paced, lots of different things every day, often with very tight timelines, long hours. I take my work home with me. I do it on weekends. When the minister calls, you have to drop everything and do it, even if you're having a bath. It's highly variable. So last week, I dealt with issues pertaining to a blue whale that washed up on the shore in Cape Breton, to monarch butterflies, to attending a court hearing, which I'm going to do again tomorrow. Often, I have 20 plus files at a time on my desk. Some of them fall off the desk, and you periodically have to resurrect them. As I mentioned, there's no easy answers. I deal with exceptions rather than rules. Tremendous amount of policy development, including drafting of legislation. I do tend to encounter, I'm on the hot seat a fair bit of time, as is our whole department. So we deal with people who are emotional. We deal with the media. And you have to develop a thick skin, and you have to be able to keep things in perspective. And work-life balance is particularly important, although I haven't managed that quite to the degree that I should as of yet. To wrap up, I hope my advice to you is more helpful than the cartoon conveys. I'd like to pass along the following messages. Enjoy the ride and the process. The process is never over, so don't think about endpoints. See the opportunity that arises at every turn and every bump. Learn the lessons that those experiences offer. Finally, take advantage of every opportunity you can to learn something new and to develop a new skill. I'm sure there's a punchline. So remember, it's about the journey and not the destination. Thank you.